If you would, open up to Matthew chapter 8. As you know, we've finally come down off the mountain and working our way down. Of course, as Matthew talked about it last week in terms of chapter 8, the very first story that it shares after the Sermon on the Mount is the story of a leper who is an outcast in every sense. And yet to appeal to Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. It's not if you're able. He says, if you're willing. And sure enough, he does. And then he's sent off back to the temple down in Jerusalem to go make an offering as a witness to the offering itself, as a witness to the priests that will be there to administer these things, and to call for that priest to come out to him outside of the city, and then for him to be not only cleansed, but also to be rededicated back to God. Then, if you notice down in verse 5, it says, and when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him, came to him, begging him. Now, Capernaum, if you look at the Gospel of Luke chapter 6, I think it's verse 17 and 18, it gives you kind of these details about the Sermon on the Mount, about where it takes place, just in a very general idea, in terms of there are people who are there to listen from Judea, from Jerusalem, from the nations of Tyre and Sidon, which are kind of up along the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee. And so it kind of leaves you with this thought that the Sermon on the Mount probably took place somewhere up in Galilee. And so the very first place that gets mentioned, in 8:1, it talks about Jesus came down from the mountain. And when you get to verse 5, and when Jesus entered Capernaum. And so here's Capernaum that sits really just about 10 to 15 miles away from all this mountainous territory. And after traveling together, here's a crowd that comes together with Jesus. And as they're going, he enters into the city of Capernaum. And you may see within that, and sometimes this one always throws me off, because you can say Capernaum or you can say Capernaum. Either one of them are just as fine. It's like tomato, tomato. And so you look at this and go, the whole idea about Capernaum, I hope you can hear Nahum, the Old Testament prophet, in that. Capernaum literally means the sorrow of Nahum. So it's the idea about a place where someone has some sorrow. What happens in repentance, you get taken care of whenever you respond out of sorrow to do what's right. He says, when Jesus entered Capernaum, which is right on the Sea of Galilee, on the shore, he says, a centurion came to him imploring him. Now, just in generality, when you hear centurion, what do you think of? Roman, military, soldier, big, over 100 men are under kind of his reign or his jurisdiction. And so here's a man who's associated with so many things, yet as soon as Jesus enters Capernaum, this centurion comes up to him begging him for something, imploring him. And I hope you can kind of see the word beg in that. Verse 6, what would compel a centurion to seek out Jesus like this? And you might even be thinking, how would he come to know about Jesus like this? But notice how it continues, verse 6. And saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Who has he come on behalf of? His servant. Now, typically, do you think of centurions as taking care of their servants like this? Notice, this is not one of his soldiers, one of his 100. This is one of his servants. Now, what do you see as the situation at hand in verse 6? Paralyzed is kind of the key little thing we think. But yet, I want you to kind of notice something. He says, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. It's not just the idea of him being paralyzed. There's something really that's going on that he's just tormented over. and in a fearful way. Now, I want to use kind of a parallel account of Matthew 8 so that you can maybe get a better picture of this. And Luke has a little bit of a different, additional details, not different, but additional. Look over at Luke chapter 7 real quick. I don't typically like to do this, to just look from gospel account to gospel account, because sometimes their point in telling the story is different, even though it's the same telling of a story. I want you to kind of notice Luke chapter 7, and then look at verse 2. And once again, if you want to look at verse 1 to see the parallel, it says, when he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, Luke chapter 6 is the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, in Luke. He says he went to Capernaum, which tells you, all right, here's where we are, same place and time, verse 2. And a centurion's slave who was highly regarded by him was sick and about to die. Notice, when Luke tells this story, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that this servant is paralyzed. That's not really the key aspect here. Here's a centurion who's saying he has a slave who is highly regarded by him and is so sick that he's sick to the point of death. Now, so understand, see that kind of as a clarity for where we're at. Look back over at Matthew chapter 8. So whenever you see the statement in verse 6, Lord, and notice once again, here's a Roman centurion carrying authority, and notice how he appeals to Jesus. Lord, I'm ready to submit to you. He says, Lord, he says, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. And whenever you think about that kind of moment in time of being sick to the point of death, I'm pretty confident in this, maybe not. I think all of us have been in a family situation or a situation with a close friend where you know that death is knocking at the door. And you can kind of put yourself back in a setting like that where you know what, this is not looking good. This is looking like the end. And here specifically, this centurion getting that close to the end, I know in some families, when it gets that close to the end, nobody wants to leave. Nobody wants to leave the side of their loved one. And yet notice, this centurion's slave is so highly regarded by the centurion that he leaves, even though he knows that his servant is sick to the point of death, fearfully tormented. And he leaves. What does that tell you about what he thinks about Jesus? He believes that Jesus can do something about this, right? And he really cares for his servant or his slave. So, just to kind of give you a picture of what we're really reading about here. Then, verse 7. Jesus hears this one statement, and look at how he responds. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. Now, what does that tell you about the heart of Jesus? Right. You notice the response of Jesus. So many times, I'm afraid that whenever we pray, we feel like we have to give every detail in order for Jesus to respond in according to what we need in the moment. And I want you to think about, as you're raising your children, sometimes whenever they would come and ask for something, you already knew what they needed. They didn't have to word it perfectly. They didn't have to make all the grammatical correct sentence. Because of the heart. You knew what was needed. And yet here's Jesus, and notice in verse 6, was there any question that the centurion asked Jesus? No? Did he make any appeal to him? No. He just lays out the situation at hand. He says, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus' response, I will come and heal him. And you would expect at that moment, it's just like, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. This is what I was hoping for. But you quickly realize here that's not at all what he was hoping for. Which may throw us a little like, You mean he's going to respond and we're not necessarily wanting that? So he says, I'll come and heal him. Verse 8. But the centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. He says, you don't have to come. Now, how many people would turn Jesus down if he was going to come to your house? I think nobody. Yet here's this centurion, a Roman. We'll find that out that he's not Jewish here in a moment for sure. And he says, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. How does the centurion see himself in light of Jesus? I'm not worthy. You are so much higher than me. You don't need to come to my house. I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. And that shows how he believed that Jesus could change the situation and heal his servant, right? I want you to just make sure that you see how this word worthy is being used. It's translated a little bit different, but look back in Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 3. Look at verse 11. This is John talking about Jesus. See if you can figure out which word in verse 11 is the same Greek word as what's over in Matthew chapter 8 that we just read for worthy. It's not going to be translated word for word, but see if you can figure it out. Let's read it first. For all of us. I know y'all are so far ahead. Matthew chapter 3, verse 11. As for me, John talking about himself, I baptize you with water for repentance, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I, and I am not fit to remove his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. And of course, what's the parallel? He says, I'm not fit. And it's the same Greek word that's over in Matthew chapter 8. The idea that this centurion is really saying is, you are so far beyond me, I am not worthy for you to come into my house. And you think about the way this centurion saw Jesus. You realize, do we ever get caught up in this thinking of going, Jesus is great, Jesus is awesome, but it's fine for me to be in his presence on my own. The only reason we can come into God's presence is because of who? Because of Jesus, because of his blood, right? So sometimes these things even get lost on us. Back to Matthew chapter 8. This is probably not your typical story of a centurion. Like, centurion's over 100 men. You kind of think rough, rugged, tough, stare down the enemy. Don't mess with me. I'll deal with you. And then you run into somebody like this, and you realize he is not your typical, normal centurion. Right. And that's exactly where we're going. Look at verse 9. And of course in verse 8, he says, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. You just say it. You just speak it. Then I'm out of here. I mean, it's almost the way he makes it sound. He says, just say the word and my servant will be healed. I mean, and think about the stretches of this. How sick is his servant? To the point of death. I mean, you think in terms of, we're no longer counting weeks. We're no longer counting perhaps even days. We're counting hours. That's the way we think about things when it gets really down to the point of death and a sickness. We're not going, well, maybe I'll go over there next week. When it's something to the point of death, you're like, we better go today because he or she might not be alive tomorrow. So, you see what's going on here. He says, my servant will be healed. Verse 9, for I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now, notice how he introduces himself. He doesn't say, you know what, I understand authority. He says, I'm a man who's under authority. I have people that I have to submit to. And a centurion, if you don't know this, the centurions served underneath a centurion who was the head centurion. And underneath him was a tribunal, a military tribunal of about 6 men. And he says, I don't get to just do things on my own. He says, I know what it's like to be under authority. And then he turns it around. He says, and I also know what it's like to have authority. Because then he flips it, doesn't he? Because now he starts talking about, he says, with soldiers under me. He says, and I know how this works. I tell this one to go, and he goes. I tell this one to come, and he comes. I tell him to do this, and he does it. That's how it happens. I just say it. And it changes the direction of the way things are going. Now, there's something about this that really sticks out to me. He says, I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, which tells you they might be off at a distance. They might be off in another town. And I tell them to come back, and you know what they do? They come. I don't have to be standing right there next to them. I can just send the message and it'll happen. Then he says, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Which tells you something about this slave perhaps too. He says, there was a time when I could tell him to do something and he would do it. But now he's fearfully tormented and he needs help. And he's highly regarded. We learn that from Luke's account. Then he really gets down to the heart of the matter in all this. And look at how Jesus takes this. Now, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. Now, let's put some pieces together. Number one, who was Jesus talking to in this moment? The crowd that's following him. Where had that crowd been? Sermon on the Mount. These were those same people that Jesus said, to the one who hears these words of mine and acts upon them, he'll be like a wise man. To the one who hears these words of mine and doesn't act upon them is like a foolish man. And now here's this big crowd of people who've been following Jesus, and here's this centurion who is not Jewish, because he is not from the people of Israel. It's as if you see Jesus turn around to this humongous crowd that's with him and go, this is what I've been looking for. You need to learn from this Roman centurion. You may have been up on the mountain with me, but until you start to grasp what faith really is, you're not going to make it. And he's going to go on to really iron that one out. What do you think that would do to all these Jewish people who are from Judea and Jerusalem? Now, there were also people from Tyre and Sidon who were definitely probably not Jewish at all. And to go, look here. Are you ready to recognize authority? He gets it. What about you? Now, another aspect of this in verse 10 says, now when Jesus heard this, he marveled. Now, just to kind of give you a little parallel, sometimes we see marvel and we go, well, what's really going on here with marveling? Same word is used with describing the disciples whenever they are in the storm on the Sea of Galilee and Jesus is awoken and they say, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care that we're dying here? And Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and it becomes perfectly calm. And that's whenever it describes the disciples as they were amazed. It's the same word here for marveled. Can you imagine being in the midst of some of these heavy storms we've been having? Can you imagine having somebody at your house who would just step outside and say, hush, and then everything just goes perfectly calm? How would you respond? What just happened here? Now, here's the aspect that we need to kind of hone in on in verse 10. When Jesus heard this, and what had he just heard from the centurion? What did this centurion truly understand? The authority of Jesus. He understood something about Jesus' authority. And now, if you notice it here, it says he marveled. It's not that Jesus had never seen faith before. Out of all the people who would truly grasp faith, it's not a Jew first. It's someone who's a centurion.
It doesn't say whether he listened, right? Because he came to the Sermon on the Mount, so he probably...
Right, he's not at the Sermon on the Mount. He's there. Yes. Right. Exactly. If you notice what's here, not only does the centurion recognize the authority of Jesus, what aspect do you see the centurion have? What characteristic? Humility, which leads him to being a servant of his own servant, right? Because whose behalf is he there on? His own servant. This is what faith really is. I know we love to have, definitions for what faith is. But if you notice, this is Jesus putting the stamp on this. You really want to know what faith is? Faith recognizes the authority of Jesus. Old Testament, faith recognizes the authority of God. To be able to keep His promises, to be able to keep His word, as well as faith also comes together with humility. I recognize my part in this. And it is not as an equal with Jesus, although we know by His grace we're fellow heirs of the grace of life, but that's a gift. Remember that. Humility. And here he comes saying, I recognize the authority that you have. I recognize your ability to change what's going on with my servant who's fearfully tormented. And he comes, and if you notice in the statements, in verse 6, first word of his statement, Lord. Verse 8, first word of his statement, Lord. Do you see the submissiveness? And then whenever Jesus says, I'll come and heal him, he says, I'm not worthy for you to do that. I'm not worthy for that. Then, even in verse 10, he says, he marveled at him. Here's someone who not only recognizes my authority, they also see themselves in the right way in terms of humility. Then, if you notice how it continues in verse 10, he says, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. Now think of who all that includes. Now, really take that in. Because who have we seen in the Gospel of Matthew so far? even John the Baptist, right? Isn't John the Baptist of Israel? Yeah. What about his own mother and father? Yeah, they're Israelites. So you start to notice this is really where faith should get its definition of going, the recognition of the authority of Jesus. Lois. Right. Even more so, an even bigger picture, because what are the Jews going to struggle with? If somebody calls themselves the Son of God, we have the right to kill them. And yet here's someone who says, I'm also someone under authority. That's a great point, Lois. And so you notice here, he says, I haven't found such great faith with anyone in Israel. What should this have done with that big old crowd that was following? Now, think about that, because that is a response. And what mindset would they have to have in order for it to make them mad? Jealousy. Envy. Is there any humility in that? See, instead you get pride. Let's see. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. What do you think this centurion's about to encounter? Grace. Because grace is always associated with faith, right? Now, notice how this continues on. He says, I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. And then he goes on into verse 11. He says, I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Well, that must have been an eye-opener. Here's something else. When you really look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what were they all examples of? What were they willing to show? Faith. Were they willing to submit themselves under God's authority? Yes. Now, did they fail at that from time to time? Yes. But at the same time, then they come back and they realize their mistakes. And they change them. Except for, I know there's a couple in there. I mean, Abraham makes his mistake about lying about Sarah, or being deceptive about Sarah on more than one occasion. But, yes. On his behalf. Right. Right. And you realize, here he is once again in this great, great humility. And so, whenever you see here in verse 11, he says, we're going to recline at a table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, which tells you who is still living, but not on earth. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why are they going to be in the kingdom of heaven? Because of trust in the authority of God. Whenever you think about the story of Abraham offering up Isaac on Mount Moriah, who is he trusting? He's trusting God's authority. He knew that God made a promise. He knew that if he does, since he's planning to carry out Isaac as a burnt offering in Genesis 22, that the promises come through Isaac. And so in Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about he knew that God was going to raise up Isaac from a bunch of cremated ash back to life because he trusted the authority of God. You see how these things happen again with Isaac and with Jacob. Over and over again, looking at God in terms of authority and power and looking at self in terms of humility. And how does God call that? This is what faith is. This is what it is. And that's why it brings out that definition that we typically think of in Hebrews 11. That's why faith is the assurance of things hoped for. because you recognize the authority of God, and we'll keep ourselves humble under what He desires. The conviction of things not seen. I don't have to see it in front of me. That's what this centurion's saying, isn't he? You don't have to come. I'm not worthy for you to come. You just say the word and it'll happen. You see these same things coming together to get perhaps a more rounded picture of what faith really is. Whenever we read about the promises that God makes in Jesus, of going, do I trust that God will keep that promise? Do I trust that He stands in authority to be able to grant eternal life in Jesus? Whoa, eternal life. And now notice who He's bringing out as examples: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Men who are of faith. Now, even within them, it had to be refined. And He says, there's going to be people coming from east and west, all over this planet. He says, and they're going to get to recline and eat with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You think you would want to sit at that table? Might you want to ask Isaac, what did you think whenever your father tied you up and put you on the altar? And he had that knife stretched out. Did you trust him? Or would you have ran if you weren't tied up? A lot of questions in there, isn't there? Things you might want to talk about. Here they are. Then he's going to switch gears in verse 12. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness. The sons of what? The sons of the kingdom. Might you want to think, is this a misprint? It's not. But do you see how all of a sudden he's completely flipping this picture? Because he says, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness. Now, I know for us, we have lights, electricity in the house. You turn the lights on. Some lights are kind of dusk till dawn lights. Some lights, you turn on and you forget all about them. You leave them on. For them, whenever they had light, it came at a price. I'm not just talking about paying the utility bill. You only have so much oil to burn in your lamps. You only have so many candles to burn. And so whenever they would throw, I'm going to use the term celebration or feast, or we would probably say party. They would turn the lights on. They would light the lamps. They would light the candles. The lamp would be put on a lampstand. And here was the picture. And right there where everything was happening, it was all lit up. But if all of a sudden you did something that was so against the host, guess what would happen to you? You wouldn't just be cast into the darkness. You'd be cast into the outer darkness. I mean, this is the idea of shame. Utter shame because of your own actions. Then notice what else he brings up. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I want you to think in terms of things that are detrimental. I know there can be tears of joy, but that's not what we're talking about here. What typically makes people weep? Sadness, pain, regret. You ever find that typically you see these things all together when we get overwhelmed? Isn't that whenever the tears kind of start to flow? It's like you can't even really put it into words. And if you notice, of recognizing because of their own actions, they've been cast out into the outer darkness, weeping. And then it comes to the other aspect that's described, and gnashing of teeth. When do people typically grit their teeth? Stress, extreme pain, those type of situations. We might want to use a word like torment. You start going back through it and realize this outer darkness thing is not just, the lights went out. This is a place of being overwhelmed in terms of regret, in realizing your actions have come at a price to take you out there, and a great pain that is being endured. Now, what picture is he really painting here? It's not just being thrown out of the party. It's the picture of Gehenna, the picture of torment. Now, I want to deal with this before we get too far, because I want you to see in verse 12, it says, "But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness." And notice he's talking specifically about those of the kingdom. I want you to look, we're going to fast forward a little bit in Matthew. Look over at Matthew chapter 13. There's a specific parable that Jesus is going to tell later that I'm just going to go ahead and bring it in now. Of the parable of the wheat and the tares. Tares are basically an imitation wheat, but it doesn't produce any grain. It's worthless. It just takes up the soil. And we'll read through the parable first, and then we'll read the explanation. And I want you to kind of notice some things as we go. Matthew chapter 13, look at verse 24. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." So notice the comparison is to the kingdom of heaven, just like what we're looking at over in Matthew 8. He says, "The kingdom of heaven be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field." So there's a man, he's sowing good seed, it's his field. Verse 25. "But while his men were sleeping," not while he was sleeping, while his men were sleeping, "his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away." Verse 26. Tares are an imitation that looks like wheat in the beginning, but it never produces any grain. In other words, it has no value. Weeds is what some might say. Then, in the same idea as gold and fool's gold. Here we go. Verse 26. "But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also." Because guess what they don't bear? They don't bear grain. Verse 27. "The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?'" The slaves know that the seed was good of what they put out. He says, "Then how did we end up like this? Why the tares among the wheat?" Then, verse 28, the landowner gives a response. He says, "And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this!' Exclamation point. The slave said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up? Do you want us to go gather up the tares?' But he said, 'No. For while you're gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them,'" which tells you the wheat and the tares are growing together. Notice how it continues. Verse 30. "Allow both to grow together until the harvest, and in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, 'First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, and gather the wheat into my barn.'" He says that the harvest is when they'll all be separated out. Now, let's skip down to the explanation of this. I'm sure you're very aware of what the explanation is and what fits where. But verse 36. "Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples came to him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field.'" Did they get it instantly? No, we wouldn't have either. The only reason that we can kind of see what's coming is because we've already read this story before. Verse 37. "Then he said, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man.'" Oh, who's sowing the seed? Jesus. No wonder it talks about him sowing the seed of the kingdom. Then, verse 38, "And the field is the world." So, who's contained in the world? Both the tares and the wheat. But what do they represent? He says, "As for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one." Now, pay close attention, because he only brings up two. He says, the wheat are the sons of the kingdom, the tares are the sons of the evil one. Now, remember from Matthew chapter 8, he said the sons of the kingdom are going to be thrown into the outer darkness. So make sure and just plant that away, but don't take it too far. Notice the seed, what Jesus is speaking, if you'll submit to it by faith, put yourself humbly underneath it, what will it make you? A son of the kingdom. He says, and then there's the evil one who gives out all this stuff that's going to take you nowhere, like tares. He says, they're the sons of the evil one, verse 39. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. If you wonder who the enemy is that came in at night and sowed this, it's the devil. He says, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. In other words, here's the angels coming in and reaping the sons of the kingdom, the sons of the evil one, and to realize all these things together. So you realize basically in the parable, those who are his slaves are the angels in the story. Verse 40. Now, pay close attention, because you're going to see 3 different reapings. I thought we just had sons of the kingdom and sons of the evil one. How are we going to get 3 reapings out of this? Well, let's just pay attention and see if we can figure it out. Verse 40. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. So what happens to the sons of the evil one, or the tares? They get gathered up, and who's going to harvest them? Angels. He says, and burned with fire. He says, and that's the way it'll be at the end of the age, which is the harvest. Okay, there's reaping number 1. Reaping number 2, verse 41. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness. Now notice where these are coming out of. His kingdom. This is the wheat, but how have they responded? What do they lack? Faith. Isn't that something? Because in order to be lawless, what do you have to do in regard to what Jesus is saying? You've got to rebel against it, right? You have to act like Jesus' word doesn't have any authority. Now, I want you to take a moment here. How many religious people reject the words of Jesus when it comes to making their conclusions? In all the teachings that you hear, we had better make sure that it lines up with the words of Jesus. Because if it doesn't, what does it make us? Lawless. We're going to do it our own way. And by the way, even in 1 John, John talks about, and lawlessness is sin. We're rebelling against what God has said. We're rebelling against what Jesus has said. Then he says, and all stumbling blocks. What if we're just going to keep on doing things in a wrong fashion? He says, we're not even going to try to change. Now, let's see what happens with this second reaping. Verse 42. And we'll throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, sounds just like Matthew chapter 8, doesn't it? Here's something else I want to point out. If you look back at verse 40, the sons of the evil one, where were they burned? It just says burned with fire. The sons of the kingdom, who are lawless, where are they thrown? In the furnace of the fire. Better or worse? Worse. You mean to know the right thing and not to do it results in a worse judgment? That's the way it sounds, isn't it? And we can look at other stories that would parallel that idea in Luke. If you remember about the slave who didn't know what the master's will was and did those things, says he'll be beaten with few stripes. The one who knew the master's will and didn't do it, he's beaten with many stripes. Now, take that for what it's worth. Here in verse 42, it says, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Because doesn't it really make you want to kick yourself in the pants? When you were given the right answer, and because you didn't take it, you suffered greatly for it. You ever had that kind of regret? Somebody gave you sound wisdom from God, and then we rebelled against it and we suffered for it. And we went, how could I be so foolish? Then, so there's 2 reapings, and one of them has come out of the sons of the kingdom. Does it make you hope there's another reaping? Yeah, let's look at it. Verse 43, here's the payoff. Third one's the charm. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And of course, this is a quotation out of the Old Testament, out of Daniel chapter 12. He says, then the righteous, now here's another kicker for you. Righteousness always comes by faith. You see the common threads through here? Of going, here's a faith response. So, he says, the righteous will shine forth as the sun, S-U-N, in the kingdom of their Father. Oh, welcome. Then, of course, he who has ears, let him hear. And you realize, here's faith working. Faith that says, you know what? We recognize the authority of God. We recognize that we have to humble ourselves and we're not worthy of Him, and to respond out of faith to trust Him, even when we can't see it with our very own eyes. Now, come back to Matthew chapter 8. So now you can see what Jesus is really driving at through this second part. When you get to verse 10, there's a reason he marvels at this centurion, because he's not someone who's part of the kingdom in terms of he's not a Jew. And then to go, he says, I haven't found this kind of faith even in all of Israel, even among all of God's people who recognize authority and see themselves as unworthy on their own. Then, in verse 11, I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Were they lawless? Were they stumbling blocks? No. And that's why they're there. Are they shining forth? Yes. Then, verse 12, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Because what's lacking? Faith. The recognition of the authority of God. The recognition of the authority of the words of Jesus. And because there's no faith responding, it leaves you cut off, cast out into the outer darkness. Can you imagine showing up to a place and all of a sudden here's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob present, and you think to yourself, oh, I get to talk to them. And then because of your own foolish, wicked actions, you get cast into the outer darkness. I could have been sitting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I could have been learning about faith. And now, because of my own actions, I'm cast out into the outer darkness. And all of a sudden, the overwhelming response of tears, the pain and the torment of knowing what I'm missing out on because of my own stupidity and pride. Then, he brings us together, verse 13. And Jesus said to the centurion, go. It shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of a response. Jesus says it very specifically. It shall be done for you as you have believed. What did he believe? He believed that Jesus didn't have to be up close and actually lay his hand on him. He just has to say it, and it'll be done. And he said, and do you think about it? He said, go. He didn't say, I heal your servant. He doesn't say, he'll be doing just fine and dandy when you get back. He just says, go. He says, it'll be done as you have believed. Can you imagine if that was God's response to something that we had prayed for? It'll be done as you have believed. It would surely make you think, maybe I could believe more. Maybe I could really strive better. But for him, he knew what that meant. And if you notice, look at the way it's talked about in verse 13. And his servant was healed that very moment. So whenever the centurion got back, and of course he was met with, I don't know if the servant came out first or not, but going, Oh man, look, he's completely healed. It makes you wonder if it wasn't a question. What time did he start feeling better? He said, at whatever time, it was a comparison of going, I know whenever Jesus said it. When did it happen? That very moment. What would that do to your faith? Strengthen, encourage, bring about a stronger conviction, and you see those things together. Karen.
You almost think, okay, he's telling this centurion or telling people, I haven't seen anyone in all of Israel such as great. And then when he says, the sons of the kingdom, you almost think, well, what's that? Wait a minute, what's that got to do with, the story of the centurion? But he's turning to them, telling them, this man's got great faith, and there's going to be some of you who are in the kingdom, but you're not going to make it.
Right. You think about it. You're going to be lawless. You're going to be stumbling blocks. He says all stumbling blocks. He says you're going to be cast out. I want you to notice one more parallel. Here are people who he's saying, I haven't seen such great faith like this in all of Israel. Here are all these people who have been with him. They've heard the teaching on the mountain. Do they get to see the outcome? They don't. Not unless they go and find where that centurion lives and ask about that servant who had been sick.
I thought it kind of unique in this instance. He didn't say go and not say anything or go and tell it, like in the previous ones.
Right, with the leper. It is something, he just says go. And you imagine as he goes, what do you know faith is drawing inside of him? Is he going back going, well, I hope something happened? Do you see the excitement that there would have had to been to go, I'm going to go home. Whenever I left, my servant was sick to the point of death. I'm going to go back, and he is going to be, you almost wonder, he's going to be turning cartwheels. I don't know. But whatever kind of thinking going on there. And realizing, this is great. This is wonderful. And you also see the heart of the centurion of going, whose needs is he putting ahead of his own? His servants. Which tells you a little something there.
It's just kind of a side thought that as this is going on, it's another example on how Jesus was paving the way for non-Jewish people to have the opportunities, the same opportunities to come to faith with Jesus.
Right.
So those examples were there a long time before.
Before getting to Acts chapter 10. Yeah. Paving this way to see Gentiles are just as much a part of the grace of God as the Jews would be. All right, well, next time plan to come back, we'll meet up with a sick mother-in-law. So, all right, have a good week.